In the next story, we change tack to a very different women's experience, that of the nuns in the Mercy Convent in Cahir. While central to the lives of many women in the town, this was a much more complex institution than we might imagine. Josephine O'Neill began by explaining the background of the convent.
So, convent, a huge, imposing building in the town of Cahir, and it was a Mercy convent, and that was founded in 1827. The Mercy Order was founded in Baggot Street in Dublin by Catherine Macaulay, and Cahir Convent came from the convent in Cappoquin. In 1863, 3 nuns came to Cahir to establish a convent in Cahir, and it spanned a history of over 150 years. This central convent in Cahir led to the foundation of the convent in Portlaw, in Cahir, in Ballyporeen, and these nuns established schools in Cahir, Cahir, Ballyporeen, and a secondary school in Cahir. They set up a convent in Haverfordwest in England. They founded Clonmel Hospital and Cahir Hospital, and they had an apostolic school which sent young girls out to America to teach what they called Indian and coloured people. So it was a remarkable achievement from a group of women in a town, which is, it's not unusual. It happened in many Irish towns. So it was women who dedicated their lives to God to do good works of mercy.
Convent life, however, was not equal. The class structure in wider society continued inside its walls. Josephine explained this through the differing experience of choir nuns and lay nuns. She started with the choir nuns who came from wealthier backgrounds.
You couldn't just enter a convent, you had to have money. So you can see in Waterford, I saw one dowry for €300, which I checked would be about 36,000 in today's money. You came in with this money, which couldn't be touched until you died, but the convent got the interest from the money you put in. And it's, say, down from £300 to £33. So that was essential, the dowry. Now, I know one woman told me that in order to keep your relative a choir nun, sometimes the nun, there would be a call from the convent to send something. Like one woman remembered her grandmother having to send candlesticks one Christmas, and it being a huge imposition because they were very poor, but they wanted to keep her a choir nun because the choir nuns in the convent were the nuns who were the public face of the convent. They were the nuns who were the teachers and the nurses, the nuns who had the public face.
This was contrasted with lay nuns who were treated like servants.
They were the nuns who were, if you compare it to society, they were the domestics of the convent. They worked in the kitchens and the laundries. They didn't vote in elections. They didn't eat with the choir nuns, and they had no say in the running of the convent. And I thought it was sad, they didn't have any formation. They had basic education, but they weren't educated beyond their status. So they were, and I thought it was sad when, for instance, the Cahir nuns went on holiday to Ardmore at the time when there were lay and choir nuns. The lay nuns went into the kitchen in Ardmore. So even though you were going on holiday, you were going on holiday into the kitchen of the convent. Yeah. So you wonder then, why did nuns become lay nuns? It's obvious why you'd become a choir nun, and people would suggest that in an era of poverty, it provided you with a safe haven. You were going into a place where you'd be provided for. You worked very hard, and you couldn't become a choir nun, no matter how long you stayed in the convent. But they were the domestic servants of the convent, and it was very obvious that they were different, whereas the choir nuns were the more powerful nuns.
Josephine went on to explain why women joined the convent. The reasons were far more complex than initially appears.
The first thing would have been religious. Obviously, you would imagine that you were more assured of salvation if you became a nun. The next thing was education and status. If you would remain single and still retain a status if you were a nun. And possibly the only powerful woman you'd have known would have been the local nun who was a teacher. So you would that would make you think, well, if I want to gain an education, then I would go into a convent. And if I wanted power, a lot of, and you can see it in Cahir Convent, a lot of nuns went in because their sisters were there. So it was a family thing. You could have 3 sisters going into a convent. In one family, you could see 5 sisters went in. So you followed your older sister. And there was, for many years in Irish society, there was this thing of having a nun and a priest in the family. So you were fulfilling the aspirations of your parents. I mean, it would be said that they were decent people. They had nuns and priests in the family. So there's that status. There's somebody said to me, I thought this was really interesting. Yesterday I was speaking to a woman called Susie Cooper, and she said there was a mystique around it because when you were received into the convent, there was a ceremony and you wore a bride's dress. Sometimes they had bridesmaids. So there was, if you're 16 and you're thinking about all that visual imagery of being received as a bride of Christ, that would really inspire you. And a sad point that a few historians have made is that a lot of women died in childbirth right up to the 1950s in Ireland. So you escape that fear of dying in childbirth. And then, I mean, the question is would you be better off marrying somebody and having a whole load of children or going into the convent? I mean, the woman we found who attended the first Navajo powwow, when she was asked if she had any regrets, she said no, because I was the oldest of 12 and I was going to be married off to an older man. So that might be a reason. And sadly now there's a lot of research being done on violence against women during the War of Independence and the Civil War. That's coming out. And there's research being done at the moment on whether the women who were involved in coming them on and who were involved in maybe the victims of sexual violence during that time, that they went into the convents in the 1920s.
Next, Josephine talked about day-to-day life in the convent.
I mean, all of the women in the convent, I would say, worked really hard. One nun said to me that she was a teacher and you were judged in the convent by the copies you brought home to correct. So they worked very hard. It was very hierarchical structure within the convent. I mean, the Reverend Mother was very powerful and she was elected by secret ballot. And when they went in to train, they had 2 years of a novitiate where you withdrew and you studied and you reflected. And then the community voted on you, on whether you were suitable. And they took 4 vows: celibacy, poverty, obedience, and service to the poor, sick, and the work of education. So temporary vows lasted from 3 to 6 years, and then you took your perpetual vows. But, I mean, the image people have of convents would be obviously that they were all very calm and centered and prayerful, but that can't have been true because you had obviously you tried to live with adults. I mean, we went down at one stage to the diocesan archives and we found a nun, a Sister Joseph, and she entered, and she was extraordinary. She entered. 3 nuns came from Cappoquin in 1863. And Sister Joseph entered the next year. And she came from a family, a farming family in Latin. And in the year she died, the other nun who entered with her, Mary Kennedy, died of pneumonia due to the damp conditions in the first house they were in Cahir. So it has to have been tough. Now, I can't find it. I assume she taught because the early nuns worked with the poor and they taught. But we found letters in 1887 when she's writing to the bishop to complain the Reverend Mother. And she addresses him as my dear and respected Lord. You can see the hierarchy of the status of women in society. And then they went into they're part of a church that's very hierarchical. And patriarchal, and then they're in a convent, which is very hierarchical. And she complains about what she calls the tyranny of the Reverend Mother. She said that this woman had availed of every opportunity to crush her. And that the Reverend Mother said the veil ought to be taken from her. And I loved her because you think she was actually making a stand. She was writing to the bishop, and at one stage she said that the Reverend Mother ordered her to go to her cell, and she refused. And she said, "I said I would not, that no one is bound to obey when the superior is commanding what we never vowed." And then it's really sad, she says, after these conflicts with the Reverend Mother, she'd go to the church, she'd renew her vows and place herself in the hands of God. Now, interesting, I looked up newspapers for when she died at only 56. And the only reference I found to her was her footsteps heading gently, her calm and tender face. I thought this was written by somebody from the town as a tribute to her, but I thought, little did they know this woman whose footsteps were heading gently around Cahir and had a calm and tender face was actually writing to the bishop saying the Reverend Mother is a tyrant. And then I found other letters from another nun who it would appear had been really important in the building of the convents in Cahir and Ballyporeen. And she says, "After 11 years of worry and care, I am threatened to be brought before the bishop and accused of squandering the means of the sisters." She said that the buildings are to be thrown up and the roof timbers returned to Waterford. So here's another woman in huge conflict with power, the petty authority within the convent, who obviously, 11 years of worry and care trying to build these convents, and then she's accused of squandering money.
Given some women had very difficult lives, the question arises, why didn't they leave the convent?
Very unlikely that you'd leave. One woman said to me that she wanted to leave. She wasn't a Cahir nun, she was a mercy nun in another convent. And when she went home and told them, her sister, who was married with very young children, said to her, "I would prefer to die than face the disgrace in the town of this." It was really hard to leave. It was like, you have this person who's become, what do you do with somebody who comes back when you've had all this, the pride and the honour of somebody entering? So obviously Sister Joseph wasn't happy, but where would you go? What would you do?
Finally, Josephine detailed the final years of the Mercy Convent in Cahir.
The last nuns left in 2014. The convent doors closed and the lights were put off. And the community had hoped to get the convent back, but the convent was sold. So it's empty now. And the women, some of the women are buried in the convent, and then some of them are buried in the... As it became obvious that the convent was going to close, some of the nuns opted to be buried in the parish grounds. So you have well over 100 women who over the period were the sisters in the Mercy and Cahir.